Yeah, someone bugged me if my shadow is actually getting in the way of stuff on the slides. Yeah, I like my slide, my talks to be interactive, so if there's something that you are wondering or whatever, I might address it later, but if you're really being bugged by it, stick your hand up and I'll take questions in the middle. Sorry? Do I have a...
Sorry, I didn't quite understand. What I wanted to know is if someone can check our stream. I think everything is okay on stage.
So,
Thank you.
I'll start with information. And this is the world of Hollywood, the Recording Industry Association of America, Pfizer, and Microsoft. And it's a world where it's a world where power resides with those who can control information, and intellectual property is a way of not just making money from being creative. It's a way of locking people out of competition, and it's a way of extorting ridiculous profits when they will not be available, and it's also a way of preventing people from doing things that might otherwise be very constructive, as I'm sure many people in the audience will be aware. So, some of the key aspects of that feudalism, there's the distribution infrastructure. That's the old-fashioned infrastructure of the Recording Industry Association, for example. The fact that they can get CDs out into the shops, and it's very hard for small competitors to actually enter into that market. It's the network externalities that have allowed Microsoft that position of dominance. Network externalities, for people who aren't familiar with the term, is an economics term which basically describes the way that once a standard has been set, it's very hard for people to break out of that standard. And if you have proprietary standards, as you do with Microsoft, you're all, I'm sure, very aware of the way that Microsoft has been able to turn those standards into a ridiculous, powerful monopoly, even though there are alternative and often superior operating systems around. So, I don't know how many people here are familiar with TRIPS. Can I see hands, people who are familiar with the idea of TRIPS? So there's like about 5 people. I think it was actually mentioned or discussed in one of the talks earlier in the conference, but I'll talk about it a bit now. TRIPS is a very interesting international agreement that was signed in 1994 as part of the Uruguay War around the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT. And what it requires for signatory countries is, amongst other things, copyright laws that last for 50 years after the death of the author. It requires extensive patenting, and sorry, these echoes that we're getting, anyway, so copyright that lasts until 50 years after the death of the author, very strong patent laws. There are also laws about anti-circumvention devices. So TRIPS actually requires signatories to make anti-circumvention devices illegal, although the extent to which it requires that is not complete. And TRIPS has had fairly spectacularly damaging impacts in a lot of ways. What TRIPS is essentially about is the United States economic advantage. The US is by far the largest exporter of intellectual property in the world, and particularly the third world is being damaged and hurt very severely by TRIPS. And it's very illustrative to go back to the history of TRIPS and see where it came from to understand that. So back in the 1960s and 70s, intellectual property on an international scale was governed by an organisation you may have heard of called WIPO, or the World Intellectual Property Organisation. WIPO is part of the United Nations, and one of its key properties is that it's a one country, one vote forum. So within WIPO, third world nations are actually able to get a fairly good deal. If they don't like a particular proposal, they're able to block it. So what happened through the 60s and 70s was that every time a large pharmaceutical corporation or a large chemical corporation said, well, we want stronger patent laws to prevent third world countries from manufacturing drugs cheaply, third world countries got up in white vote and voted the proposal down. And of course, the large US pharmaceutical companies were not happy about this. And the US was essentially isolated within white vote and unable to get the kind of intellectual property laws that it wanted imposed on the rest of the world. Now, back in the early 80s, the CEO of Pfizer was on a senior US trade policy committee, and he and a few friends came up with a very bright idea, which was to link the United States trade policy to intellectual property. So even though the United States wasn't able to get what it wanted democratically in the field of intellectual property, they realized that the trade clout that the US possessed would be enough to strengthen copyright and patent laws all over the world. So the way that they did that is they enabled that they got Congress, which of course was not going to resist this idea at all because there was no lobbying to the contrary, to implement a special section 301, I think it's called, which allows special proceedings to be brought against any country that doesn't have the kinds of intellectual property laws that the United States likes. And so countries like Brazil and India, which had been manufacturing cheap drugs, for example, could on their own be targeted for actions under Section 301 in the United States. And so these economies, particularly Brazil, for example, Brazil was faced with the United States trade negotiators saying, if you don't implement stronger intellectual property laws now, we will impose unilateral sanctions against your imports from the United States. And so Brazil is not in a position to enter a one-on-one trade war with the United States. And they buckled. And the same thing happened to a large number of developing countries that had resisted the idea of strong intellectual property laws. And so through the 80s, this process continued until by the time the GATT was being signed, there was no sort of effective opposition to intellectual property on a global scale. Now, the result of the TRIPS agreement has been that in order for countries to be signatories to the GATT and members of the World Trade Organization, they need to implement these strong IP laws, and failure to do that effectively will mean that they'll face sanctions inside the World Trade Organization if they're found to be violating TRIPS. So the United States has cunningly, effectively arranged to not only be able to sanction countries itself, but to organize international sanctions against countries that refuse to implement strong intellectual property laws. So that has been the major tragedy of intellectual property, and it occurred before, I guess, the hacker community could really realize on a massive scale just how important intellectual property was going to be. But cut to the situation now in the sort of post-Napster era, and there are even more severe threats of information feudalism. The one that I'm sure a lot of people here will be very familiar with is the idea of trusted systems and digital rights management, which is essentially when copyright is difficult to enforce. Let's make little gadgets that aren't under the control of the people who own them. Let's make little gadgets that swear allegiance to the Recording Industry Association or whatever else. Let's encrypt all the content until it gets to this gadget. Let's lock up the gadget and prevent people from doing what they want with the content so that we can charge them every time they look at a document, every time they watch a film on it or a DVD, every time they listen to a song, because this is the way that you control information in the digital age. And I guess the interesting question will be to what extent it will be possible, for example, to use watermarks to track people who have broken these systems and to make these systems reasonably watertight. And there have been a number of other talks at this conference, obviously, about those subjects. So the alternative that's, I guess, at war with information feudalism at the moment, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted here when I talk about information anarchism, is the idea that really information wants to be free. That constraints on information and control of information is unnatural, and that copyright is deservedly under threat from the internet, and it will die. And For example, the free software movement has shown very elegantly that often copyright is extremely economically inefficient. The method of software development that you see with free software is clearly in many ways superior to the model adopted by Microsoft, for example. And there are sound economic reasons why that would be the case. But more generally, information anarchists have argued that the monopolies associated with copyright are unnecessary to produce, to the incentives that the justification for those monopolies are unnecessary for the production of information goods. That is, that if we don't have copyright, people will still write software, people will still write music, people will still write books. And some of the key advocates of this position, perhaps John Perry Barlow, co-founder of the EFF, in his paper in 1994, The Economy of Ideas, would have to be one of the most significant examples of that. And he has sort of identified, the theme that he identified was that relevant information now would not be information as a static thing, information as a noun, information as a book sitting on a table, but the way that people would create information and earn a living for it would be by selling services or by selling up-to-the-minute, up-to-date information, by selling subscriptions, and by reducing the cost of information enormously, making it something that people are willing to pay a few dollars for rather than hundreds of dollars for, and that there would be this new sort of economy of ideas. And in a later updated that paper that he wrote after NAFTA had taken off, he also talked about patronage as being a significant component to the new way that information would be produced, that people who could afford to sponsor the creation of something useful would do so for various reasons, and that artists would continue to be able to earn a living there. But there is a problem with both of these situations. I don't think I should really need to harp very much on the problems with information feudalism. Everyone here will be aware of the problems that result, one, from the distributional inefficiency of it, the fact that people who are poor get no information at all, they get no software, they get no music, they get no books, they get no textbooks if they're in third world countries. And the fact that derivation is made impossible. If you find a small feature that you'd like to add to Microsoft Windows, it's not like you can go and get the source code and add the feature yourself. If you find a textbook and you'd like to improve it, you can't take that textbook without the permission of the author and add an improvement to it. The problems with information anarchy relate to the fact that the amount of information created as a result of tipping or sponsorship or selling subscriptions may not be sufficient. There may be certain kinds of information which will still not be produced because the author can't make a living by writing the kinds of books that they want to, even though a lot of people would appreciate them. There are plenty of people who like to write free software and who have really useful free software projects to work on, but who don't have the time to do it because they're not getting paid. And then there's also the fact that sometimes the kinds of information that are produced will be a little bit inappropriate, because as a result of this need to find sponsorship or sell subscriptions, you may end up changing the kinds of stuff that you're producing, and instead of producing something that would have been better, you've got to modify it so that you can earn a living out. And, for example, I think Phil Zimmermann, the way I'm sure many of you have heard Phil Zimmermann talks about the cryptography work that he's trying to do, and he can't work full time on the projects that he'd like to, and then when he does, he has to change the projects as a result of the need to actually put food on the table. So there are problems with information anarchy. So the question that arises is there another solution? Is there another way that we as hackers or the community in general can tackle this problem of information production? How is it that if we don't control information, we can still allow people who produce it to earn a living? And the rather audacious answer that I propose is that we should rewrite the rules of economics. And 20 years ago, that would have sounded like sheer madness. You can't rewrite the rules of economics. They result from the way that people trade with each other. They result from the way that people do deals with each other. They result from the interpersonal interactions in our societies. But this is the internet, and the transactions that people perform and the way that economics is structured can be changed when you're talking about purely digital quantities. If you run different software to distribute information, the economics changes. And so I think there are some very exciting possibilities that we as hackers should consider in this era. So what design goals would a new economy need? What is it that we should try to achieve when we consider the problem of information production? And I think the key principle has got to be that information creations which are valued will be produced. So when there is something that people would appreciate, when there is an idea or a book or a song or a piece of software that would create benefit, that it is created in the first place. And secondly, that not only it's created, but it is distributed as widely as possible. It doesn't make sense to write a textbook and then prohibit people all over the world from copying that textbook electronically to learn. It doesn't make sense to develop an AIDS drug and then refuse to allow people dying of AIDS to use that drug. So those are the two key goals that I think need to be addressed. Then there are another, sorry.
Yeah, which firm would spend $2 million in a new AIDS drug they can't make money?
Exactly, that's exactly the problem I'm talking about. So if we look at this, this is the first point that I talk about. Information creations which are valued, such as inventing a new AIDS drug, spending $2 million in R&D, that if you create that drug, you deserve to be rewarded. Well, not deserve to be rewarded, but we as society ought to reward people who do that, because that's how we create more AIDS drugs. So if you don't provide the reward, then much of that production will not occur. I agree with you. There are questions of extent which are interesting in and of themselves and very hard to answer about how much would actually be invented with no explicit reward. So key theoretical constraints that need to be addressed by such an economic system, and there are sort of two really important ones. And they both come down to, in fact, the same thing, which is that the system needs to have local incentives. A digital economy does not make sense if it is coerced. And that is fundamentally the problem with digital rights management. You can't have an economy where the computer sitting on the consumer's desk is acting contrary to that consumer's interests. The public will undermine that system. People will hack their digital boxes that films are locked up in DCSS, for example, and copy the music and the films. So you need to have a system where local incentives are, where everyone's incentive is to actually support the system rather than undermine it. So the first point is that you can't charge for information, essentially. You can't charge consumers and say, well, hey, you're going to have to pay us $30 Australian, which is what they charge where I come from, for a CD, because people will go and download the music off Freenet. But it also means that you can't depend on voluntarism. The Street Reformer Protocol or Ian Clark's Fair Share or lots of other solutions that people have proposed to this dilemma suffer from the tragedy of the commons, which is they depend on people being generous. And certainly some people will be generous, but unfortunately too many people will not be. They'll just take the music and walk away without paying for it. So an ideal solution will address both of these problems. Then there are some additional practical constraints that need to be solved. There are legal constraints. TRIPS, for example, has placed very spectacular legal constraints on what solutions an individual country might choose to adopt to solve these problems. And of course, any solution that we as hackers would try to advocate or implement would have to be national, because changing the whole world in a single step is not really possible unless you're Microsoft or the United States of America. And political, these systems would need to be politically realistic, and they would need to actually have some kind of vision about how a real political system might implement them in practice with real levels of support. So, unfortunately, I'm sure there are a few people in the audience who will be groaning when I say this, but the answer to this problem ultimately may well be public funding. You can't produce a solution to these problems without a common resource. And if you consider it for a moment, you'll realise that a lot of the best information that has been produced has come out of universities and has come out of other publicly funded institutions, and the internet, for example, would be another spectacular instance. So really, public funding has a precedent of success in this area, but there is a difference between the kinds of proposals that I'm putting forward and the traditional way that public funding was handled. And that is decentralised allocation. It's possible with the internet to design systems that use public funding to reward people, but rather than having a single central government agency that decides who gets the funding, which is of course open to corruption and inefficiency, there may be ways of actually allocating public funding in an automatic way. And this is what I mean by really essentially rewriting the rules of economics. So two examples that you could adopt for music, for example. One would be authenticated traffic analysis. So if you wanted to replace Napster, say, a government could go out and say, well, we're going to replace Napster, we're going to actually have our own government's music servers. And rather than, these servers would have a lot of advantages over Napster, because, I mean, the level of service would be higher and you'd be guaranteed to get what you were requesting, and you would be supporting the artists while you use the system. And every time you downloaded a song off that system, it could just record that fact and authenticate the people who are downloading them, so that you don't have the artist going and downloading 100,000 copies of their own song. And another suggestion or possibility would be a voting system where people who, whenever you read a book or listen to a piece of music that you've appreciated, use a piece of free software that was pretty handy, you can just say, yep, that was good, and easily and conveniently register a vote. Yep. Yeah, so I haven't actually, what I'm talking about at the moment is for music.
What's the question?
The question was, how would you use a system like this to handle an invention like, a patent on an AIDS drug, for example? How would you reward the creation of an AIDS drug? And the answer, in fact, would be, if you wanted to analogize these systems to AIDS drugs, would be to actually monitor the sales of AIDS drugs. So you would reward a company which had invented a particular drug in proportion to the number of sales of cheap versions of those drugs. So they would still get the reward, but the end users, the people dying of AIDS in Africa, wouldn't actually have to pay for the drug.
Who is paying?
So these are publicly, as I said, these proposals are generally publicly funded, so the taxpayer does have to pick up the bill ultimately. So I'm seeing a lot of hands about this. Maybe what I should actually do, that, given that there are 5 or 6 hands, is I'll try and finish my proposal, and then hopefully some of the concerns that people are jumping up and down about will have been addressed. So from an economic point of view, and this is really a question about economics, what does it mean to say that you should use public funding to support the creation of information goods? And there's actually quite a lot of economic theory about this. In fact, information goods fall into a class of goods in economics called public goods. And public goods have 2 key properties. The first property is that they're non-rivalrous, and that means that 2 people can use the good as easily as one can once the good has been produced. So 2 people can have a cheap copy of the AIDS drug, or 2 people can use the free software. And the second property, which information hasn't always had, but which increasingly it seems to have now, is non-excludability, which means that the person who produced the good can't stop you from taking it. Once someone has recorded a song, it's on Napster, they can't prevent people from downloading it. Or on Freenet these days, I guess. And there's some economic theory about public goods. And it actually says that perhaps one of the most efficient ways, in strict economic terms, to allocate public, or to produce public goods, is actually to produce them with public funding through taxation, and to have voting systems which allow the public to decide how much of this particular thing should be produced. And of course, the inefficiency that's associated with that, provided there's no corruption, is the fact that some people will want a lot, and some people will want a little bit, and the people who want a lot will be forced to pick up some of the tab for people who want a little bit. So there is a necessary economic inefficiency with adopting this model. There is also a strong economic inefficiency in adopting the old-fashioned intellectual property model as well. That is, if you enforce excludability, for example, by passing copyright laws and prosecuting people who violate them, you have two losses. One loss is the people who no longer have access to the good because it's now too expensive. And the second loss is the transaction cost. It's the social cost of having to enforce copyright laws. It's the social turmoil that results from protests against it. And there's an increasingly high cost associated with trying to enforce intellectual property laws. So the economic theory on this matter is actually remarkably incomplete. No one has really managed to show in any general terms when it is preferable to have public funding and voting, and no one has really managed to show much about when it's better to enforce excludability. But there's a strong case with intellectual property that on both counts, both in terms of the losses associated with excluding people in developing countries, for example, and the losses of enforcing copyright law, intellectual property falls much closer towards the public good provided by public funding end of the scale. Were there still any hands about this slide? Okay, I will keep going. All right. Well, there were 5 hands, and I'm going to try and answer 5 questions now. So I figure I should try and see if I still answer any, if I can still weed out any of the questions and then come back at the end. Sorry about that. If it was 1 hand, I would answer it. So another question which a lot of people are probably jumping up and down about. I've mentioned a lot of things that could be very dangerous for privacy. I've mentioned authenticated download systems, so you log in with your account and download music from the government servers, or you register your votes with the government for what kind of books you've enjoyed reading recently. There's a lot of sensitive and dangerous privacy information that could go into the wrong hands here. And these are genuine and serious problems. And they're especially serious since you need a very strong audit trail for any of these systems, because there's a strong and clear incentive to rort the system, to cheat in some way, any way that you can, because there's a financial benefit that flows from cheating. So the answer seems to be strong pseudonymity. So whenever you register a download or you register a vote, it's pseudonymous. There's a name registered, but it's not yours. And there is a one-to-one mapping, or maybe a many-to-one mapping between this name and yours, but that mapping is not open. And in fact, the mapping should be very closed. The way that I would, for example, suggest doing would be to have 3 offline escrow agencies, which had 1/3 of the key each, and then require both publicised judicial order. So not only would an agency investigating a crime related to this system have to get an order from a court, but they would have to publicise the fact that they were doing it. And this information would be quite resistant to cracking attempts if it was stored completely offline in 3 separate locations. Another key property that would have to be present if you were going to actually attempt to do something like this would be to make the implementation entirely open. So all the source code involved would have to be open for public auditing, and you would probably have to go to great lengths to make sure that it was fairly secure. I guess the other final comment about privacy is, even with all those safeguards, you can really only get away with doing something like this because the information here, while it is sensitive, may not be as sensitive as a lot of other information you want to keep private. It's not the contents of your email, or in fact even the times that you're sending it. Ultimately, it's just information about what kinds of music or content that you have chosen to reward, which is still sensitive, but not the most sensitive information around.
Could you solve that also by effective sort of multi-level aggregation of the data?
Yes, and I think because we are dealing with a very large amount of information that will be processed in a sort of distributed fashion, that would be a key question for the architecture. So that architecture would have to not keep too much data in any one place, we have to pass it around in a
Well, for instance, in terms of purely protecting privacy, as much as you do so when you're aggregating data.
Oh, I see what you mean. Well, no. All right, there may actually be a problem with doing that in the sense that if you're trying to, for example, identify someone who has just gone and voted for the book that they wrote 100 times, you may ultimately need to be able to go back and actually extract the particular transaction records for a particular pseudonym. But at the same time, So what you can actually do is bundle it and then lock up the original version. So you could encrypt. Yeah, exactly. So to jump from the privacy aspects to the legal perspective, could a country actually implement this now? And the question is quite interesting. TRIPS, in particular Article 13 of TRIPS, which restricts what a government can do with copyrighted material, makes the game much harder. Article 13 has two requirements that impact on a scheme like this. And one of them is that whatever the government decides to do is not prejudicial to the legitimate interests of the people who own the copyright, or actually own the rights to the copyright, because it's usually not the author anymore at this stage. So when you talk about not prejudicial, basically that means not taking money away from whoever is controlling the music. And in the short term, that means the recording industry. So this system probably wouldn't undermine that entirely, because you are actually talking about giving people funding for things and giving them money for the songs that they've created. The second one that might be more difficult is a requirement that any compulsory licenses or other regulation does not conflict with the normal exploitation of copyrighted material. And that one's harder. And in fact, in this life, you probably could not actually implement such a system were it not for the pre-existence of systems like Napster and Freenet. Because when those systems do exist, the government could probably effectively argue that they weren't providing anything that wasn't available already. They weren't further interfering with the normal exploitation of CD sales or whatever. They were in fact making life easier for content owners. Another serious problem right now is the fact that TRIPS is only the baseline for intellectual property protection these days, and the United States is still doing a great deal to strengthen intellectual property laws even further. And the way they're doing that, there's been a strong backlash against TRIPS at an international level, because a lot of countries, in fact including the Netherlands, have realised that they were seriously duped by TRIPS. TRIPS is in fact about taking patent royalties and copyright royalties from most of the world and sending those to the United States. And so hundreds of countries, 110 countries that signed TRIPS, are actually losing billions of dollars as a result of this treaty. So it's kind of unfashionable, and the United States has realised that they're not going to be able to strengthen TRIPS at the international level in the short term. But what they are trying to do is actually get bilateral treaties where they're going back to the bilateral negotiating table and going to countries and saying, well, we want stronger intellectual property laws, and in exchange we'll cut you some deals, we'll do something for you, or we won't impose sanctions on this. And they're getting somewhere. And a lot of countries, particularly developing countries, are being pushed into strengthening intellectual property laws even further by the strategy that the US is adopting. If I put down the Donate to Oxfam thing, Oxfam is an NGO based in London, maybe in Oxford, I'm not sure, probably Oxford, that is doing a lot. It's actually campaigning against these bilateral treaties that the United States is pursuing on intellectual property. And that's really important work, because at the moment the door is still barely open for progressive policies on intellectual property, but the longer we wait, the worse the situation gets. So an alternative idea that you might consider is how you could use such a system for free software development. How could you automatically reward hackers who produce GPL code? And it's a really interesting question, but unfortunately it's actually much harder to apply a system like this sensibly to software development than it would be to apply it to writing or to music. And the problem is essentially that derived works really complicate things a lot. Because you need to decide when there's a derived work that people appreciate, how much of the credit should go to whom. And that's actually not really very easy to do at all. In mathematical terms, the problem is fair cake cutting. You've got a cake, which is the amount of money that's, say allocated to the Linux kernel as a result of all the fabulous things that it's done for the world. And you have to work out who deserves how much of it. And if you want to actually do that by negotiation, like by all the people involved agreeing to, in a fair way, the algorithm ends up being n squared in the number of participants. And this is n squared negotiations. So, for example, I'll demonstrate how this will work with just 2 people, and it works okay with 2 people. Actually not by n squared, I think it's n minus 1 squared, or n times n minus 1. If you've got 2 people, then the second person who's modifying the first person's code, he comes to them and says, I've got this patch. I reckon it's worth 30% of your program. And the first person can say, no, I think it's worth 80, and they can haggle over it. And of course, there may be incentives for people to cheat in that situation. But if you then have a worst case adjudication panel where you go along and say, well, we've got a dispute over this program, we can't decide who deserves what. And then that adjudication panel takes most of a slice of the money and then decides who gets what. Then both partners in that negotiation have an incentive to agree upon a reasonable value. So with 2 people, you can actually negotiate the relative value of derived works. But with more people, as you can see, n squared negotiations like that is impossible. And to illustrate why it's got to be n squared, just consider a third person coming along and negotiating with the 2 people who agreed before. And in this situation, you can actually see that there can be a problem because if 2 of the players are in league with each other, then you actually split the royalties quite unevenly. I'm staying in front of hundreds of people and I can't actually give a clear example of that. But you'll realise if you think about it for a moment that if I think the second person comes in and says, oh, that's fine, I'll take this royalty, and then they go to the third person and give them a disproportionate amount of the whole thing, which of course they have to be able to do because the third person may actually have added something to the original person's work as well as the second person's work. Then the third person can take stuff from the first person and then just hand some of it back to the second, and that way you can't do the system. You can't actually make the system work unless all of the participants agree with each other. So the problem here fundamentally is that once you get to these derived works, intellectual property is not just about who gets paid for a good idea. It's also about industrial organisation and management. It's about the way that people organise to solve large problems, and there's just a vast collection of issues there that are not easily addressed in the good kind of way that you can do it with voting systems or whatever. And if you were going to try and solve the free software development problem using some fancy distributed economic system, you would need to do a vast amount of work. Essentially, it would be of the same order of scope and complexity as reinventing the property system as a whole, and that's probably beyond the scope of anything that we could hope to consciously plan.
Yeah. Doesn't this problem basically apply to anything bigger than one person designing work?
Well, you can do it with 2. Like 2 people can negotiate
Yeah,
fair. But beyond that,
anything built in groups would have this problem.
exactly, and that, we have those problems every day. Like they exist in our society right now, and that's what I talk about industrial organisation for. We already have sets of conventions and ways of solving these problems through capitalism and investment and management and authority. And if you're going to change those things in a conscious and planned way to support free software development, it's a very gargantuan task, and I don't think one that you can actually design. I think that the property system has evolved, and the idea of trying to reinvent it while novel is probably on that scale, it's probably infeasible.
Not the individuals, it can be organizations with employees, keeping those member names down quite low.
Yeah, I've actually spent quite a while considering, not only with organisations but also sort of democratic systems where you appoint, say, Linus Torvalds to allocate credit for the Linux kernel, and then the hackers have to agree that Linus is the right person to decide who contributed what, and then you get the question of, well, what happens if Linus is cheating a whole bunch of people who he doesn't like out of their fair share? How do they resolve that dispute? Is there a way that they can end up appointing a new manager of credit if Linus is totally corrupt but still a good hacker? What do you do? And that's why there are a lot of answers to this, but none of the answers are simple and elegant to work straightforward.
I think it's all got to do with the aim of the whole game. So now, your game is money. It's all about getting as much money as you can. That's basically the game. Not everybody's playing. What I believe is that the whole set of problems you propose, they suddenly disappear once one thing changes. The nature of the game is not about getting as much money, but keep your balance in balance. So, and then suddenly it's not important for how you share this and this information open and all our problems disappear.
That's actually very true, and I think the Linux kernel community, for example, the free software community, is really striking as an example of, essentially it's a gift economy largely. And people are participating because they enjoy it, and they enjoy the contributions they make, or perhaps because they want the fame and glory or whatever. But if you're talking about the wider scale, if you're talking about not just the really elite hackers who want to do this, but you're talking about trying to organise all the people who write books and all the people who play music, there is actually a sensible reason for making money flow in the same directions as useful contributions. And that's really why capitalism works at all, because even though greed can be damaging, it also can allow people to organise. And I'm not going to keep talking about this stuff because I'm sure you're all thinking about it, and it's just going to it's a very complicated topic. But really, just quickly about free software, there are some more practical alternatives that you can apply to problems like free software and to pharmaceuticals. And these tend to be sort of more high-level solutions. They're not totally distributed voting systems, but they're more like the scientific peer review and granting systems that have funded science. So if you have a government agency that supports free software development, they can actually go down, sit down, and audit things and say, well, this project is really good, but let's fund this extra bit and add on to the end of it or whatever. And it's worked quite well for science, and it could work quite well for free software. And again, you can also use market information. So if there's a product that's being used by a huge number of people, then you can allocate more resources to the people who created it, like a pharmaceutical, for example. Another comment about the pharmaceutical industry is that the pharmaceutical industry constantly misrepresents the amount of money that it actually has to spend on drug development. And in fact, it actually doesn't let anyone see the real figures. The only people who are allowed to do analysis of how much drug development really costs are the actual employed economists who do consulting studies for the pharmaceutical industry, and no independent researchers are given access to that information. So there is reason to be suspicious of the claims that the pharmaceutical industry, through patents, actually contributes a huge amount to drug development. Realistically, a lot of commentators have observed that the public sector does a lot more, universities do a lot more in drug development than they're credited for. And this is my final slide. So some predictions. These systems, both as a theoretical idea and as hopefully one day imagine a practical possibility perhaps, will be of much more relevance to authors than they will be to either musicians or programmers. And the reason for that is that the set of coincidental incentives, if you like, that go with the work of musicians, say performing live, or programmers, say getting consulting jobs, or developing software that an organisation needs and then publicising it under a free software license. Those options aren't really there for authors. And authors essentially depend on their revenue streams at the moment. And once digital books become a serious reality and the Napster phenomenon hits authors, they're going to suffer much more than musicians have as a result of Napster. A second second observation is that these ideas will only ever become politically feasible if information anarchism is defeating information feudalism. So if you guys all get out there and finish hacking on Freenet or breaking DCSS or breaking watermarks, I hope you all do, then these kinds of ideas may become politically feasible because the intellectual property system will have collapsed. But unless it does actually collapse completely, these kinds of ideas will not be realistic. Now I'll try and take some more questions in 2 minutes. I'll try and make it quick. Yep.
My question is, you're talking about authors and musicians there. How will your proposal actually allocate the funds? Because if you're looking at the download of, let's say, using that for example, we're looking at how many times a song is taken out of the database. That's not necessarily indicative of how much I like the song.
Right, so that's the advantage of a writing system over a download system. The writing system will allow people to vote proportionally. So I really like these things. Okay. Yep.
Do you really think that intellectual property can be detached from material property as such? I mean, I was hearing the argumentation funds for software, how will the programmers and hackers survive? I think that if you extend the concept of abolition of intellectual property to the concept of abolition of property of means of production and means of consumption and the last consequence, then you don't have to...
There is a lot of interesting theory about this. I recommend there's a chapter in a book called A Philosophy of Intellectual Property, which is actually a Marxist analysis of intellectual property, which talks about some of the stuff you're addressing there. And it concludes that really fundamentally intellectual property is linked to the way that capitalism works in some deep way. But at the same time, there are important differences between intellectual property and real property. And I think there is a sense in which real property does seem like a good idea and intellectual property does not. Both need to be moderated. But they are linked, and if you did abolish intellectual property, society would certainly change in fundamental ways. Yeah.
And I'm not sure how there's discussion about musicians or filmmakers, because nowadays money in music is not made by musicians, it's made by big production corporations who launch projects just trying to find a taxation.
You're right, there are still problems in those industries which this may help only marginally. And they relate to the fact that the way to get market share is to be advertised everywhere. And that is, I guess, in some sense beyond the scope of this work. Well, the distribution of music is essentially a sole problem with the internet. Like, you don't need to worry about it. If you've got organised, sensible servers,
no problem. Everything's running fine.
Eventually,
something with the sound, but it's fixed.
All right, that's fine. You can still buy one. We're not talking about destroying the existing distribution networks completely. Yeah, exactly.
But you're talking about introducing competition in essential communal production. So basically, you're introducing the bad things that...
You're talking about Linux here?
No, I'm talking you introducing the bad things that capitalism has in property world, and you will introduce it by your voting system into the system of communal production.
I think that those capitalism is already well and truly, like the systems of greed and incentives are already well and truly alive and well within authorship or musicians.
In the physical property, but
and in the intellectual property too. I think, in fact, it's more stark and more spectacular than intellectual property. Yep.
Talk about intellectual property. Copyright protection is one part of it, right? It's also about controlling how your work is being used.
Yeah, so there's you're talking about moral rights, for example, within Europe.
Use of your work.
I think actually I would certainly still absolutely support laws against plagiarism. I think plagiarism is.
They are just unenforceable copyrights, right?
Yes, but that is true. But I don't think that legislating against them will fix that. I think that's another separate problem. Right, I think I'm going to have to go. If anyone wants to call me and strangle me afterwards, come and do that.